Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. And it's my pleasure to welcome Andrew Williams, who is a Principal Product Marketing Manager at Mimecast. Welcome. How are you today?
Thank you, Mark, for having me. It's a real privilege and honor to have this fireside chat with you.
Great. Yes, it's wonderful to connect. So we're going to be talking about the security, the IT security ecosystem today, what it is, what it means, how it connects to our understandings of overall cybersecurity and data security. So let me plunge in, if I may. Well, first of all, Andrew, why don't you very briefly introduce your role and what you do at Mimecast, and then we'll talk about the content.
Sure, Mark. So from my perspective, I look after everything ecosystems related. So Mimecast has got an amazing platform that provides email security and awareness training and archiving capabilities and associated services to provide brand protection. My role is focused specifically on all the interconnecting technologies from our Alliance Partner Network, which allow us to integrate between our platform and the associated vendor. Now, from my perspective, it's all about how can I go ahead and get the best use case to a customer and help them understand the value of integrating our technology set plus another to get that 1 + 1 = 3 effect.
Wonderful. Well, we all need the help. So that's great. So first of all, let's talk about this concept that you and I have discussed, the security ecosystem around malware. What does that term mean? How do you use it?
Well, it's broader than just malware. You know, from a security ecosystem perspective, it's all of the people, it's the processes, the technology, the software, the outsourced partners who are all working together, let's say harmoniously is probably the best word, to protect the organization. Because we don't just have one technology set, which is saying this is the entry point in. If we think of all of the different tools that have been deployed across an organization, there's infrastructure that's probably hosted in an on-premise location. There's cloud applications. You think of your AWSs, your Azures. But then we also go into SaaS-based solutions. There's CRM solutions. There's ERP solutions. There's IoT devices that connect back to some other service, particularly in the healthcare industry. That expands way beyond what a traditional enterprise would be operating in. So there's all these different services, and all of them have an entry point into the organization, and they're all connected together. That's the beauty of technology. It allows us to share information, it allows us to make a more cohesive business process, because we can take elements that we learn from here and put it onto the side over there. You know, if we think of just cloud collaboration and the tool sets we're using today to communicate, you and I are on a collaboration platform. So all of these different technology sets glue together, but we need to have a way to control that. And that's where the security ecosystem comes into play, because we need to have something that looks at web security, then something that looks at endpoint security. So the endpoints, the laptops, the mobile devices, iPads, and so on. Email security, where we play in, which is the typical business communication that's leveraged by most organizations. As much as everyone says email's dead, I'm afraid to say our inboxes say otherwise. It tends to be increasing day in, day out. So every one of those different technology sets are glued together to make up the ecosystem. And then we layer on the people that work within the organization. We then layer on top of that the managed services partners to help with incident responses and managing security solutions. And then ultimately, what's the process on how to control over this? Because like anything, when you learn to drive a car, you get given a manual, tells you what to do when you get to a stop street and what you do when you get to a traffic light. And when you see a pedestrian crossing, what takes place? How do you yield? When should you yield? All these things need to be built in, and that makes up your entire security ecosystem.
And it's fascinating to me because, of course, interconnectivity is important. It does make things a little bit more complex, doesn't it?
It makes it simpler, but at the same stage, it adds multitudes of complexity, to your point, because now suddenly the concept of your attack surface increases exponentially. Because as businesses start to integrate with each other, if we think of a typical organization, forget healthcare, which we'll definitely get into, where that expands way beyond. For a typical organization, we integrate with multiple third parties. You've got potentially outsourced legal services. You may have a third-party marketing provider, your PR agency. Then we have someone who supplies office furniture, or maybe someone who looks after your cafeteria or some on-premise style of food service. And each one of those may have a form of what we call a digital ecosystem in this case, which is everything's connected together and we share inside information through applications or portals, or maybe we connect our networks together for simplicity's sake because of how organizations operate. And that means that everything just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and multiplies from there. And we have a big problem in how can we protect that attack surface, because there's so many different ways into the organization. If I don't get in via the primary routes, well, I can go via the supply chain, because the supply chain is proving to be one of the biggest attack vectors that we've seen over particularly the last 24 months, because when it comes to our own organization, we've got control over that. But what happens with the partners we work with? Do they have as much control as us? Have they invested as much? Those are things that are very difficult to quantify and very difficult to figure out.
Well, and what you just said leads to my next question, which is, what are the biggest threats to the security ecosystem? We in healthcare, and I'll speak specifically of US healthcare, we're trying to connect more and more and more, right? We're trying to share more and more data. Population health management, care management are huge areas of focus, huge foci in the system. But we're also expanding the possibility, the potential of risk. So what are the biggest risks that you see right now?
Well, particularly from a healthcare perspective, it's the lack of control is probably one of the biggest problems, because in healthcare, we don't have everyone operating in a typical business environment where everyone does all of the different functions under one house. If we look at there's a general imaging organization, so they have some form of infrastructure located within a hospital. We've then got outsourced doctors' capabilities and their networks and all the other pieces that are associated with that. Those doctors need to be able to connect into hospital infrastructure. We then have IoT devices, potentially monitoring beds, patients, some form of surgical equipment. It really, the possibilities are endless as to all of the different players that are in a healthcare arena. And the challenge is, can you say that you've got control over how that person has patched their environment? Have you got control over what that person has got entryways into your organization? And if we look at 2021 as a bit of an idea, look at one of the outsourced IT providers, Kaseya. They were, hopefully I said that correctly, because there's been so many different pronunciations of that name, but they were hacked and people got into them. And then from there, we can start to send malicious code everywhere. So we're relying on Kaseya to provide a service to us. If they get hacked, then in essence, the malicious actors are in your organization. Right. Did you know? Did you have any visibility of that? Because it's often quite a black box service. I provide you a service, I provide you a patient record system, I provide you with an imaging system, but you don't have any control of it. You're just working with it, like your phone. Do you have control over what Apple Mail or Gmail does? No, you just use it. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is because we don't have as much control. And in essence, we don't have very much visibility either.
So one of the questions then for me would be, what are the first steps that every leader needs to take? And in our world, it will be CISOs, CIOs, CTOs at the helm. Or if they don't have those people, whoever it is. But I think people are very confused right now because there's so much going on and it's a little bit overwhelming. What are the first fundamental questions and steps that they need to engage around?
There's definitely some key things that need to be undertaken, and it's all about making security or cybersecurity part of the entire organization. We've seen in the past users within the organization go, cybersecurity is up to IT, and they don't even go security, they go, it's IT, and they throw it over that way and say, it's not my problem. But actually, the people who are more likely to be attacked are not the security people in the organization, it's the end user. Yeah. So we need to bring them in and we need to make them feel part of the problem and ultimately part of the solution. So not only are you being attacked, but you can help thwart a type of attack.
Yeah.
We then have visibility up to management level, because if management and board level, sorry, to clarify, board level is the important piece here. If we've got visibility at a board level, they know why you're wanting to spend the money in the appropriate locations. Because you can't just rock up and say, I'd like $1 million for this next best shiny thing because it's going to help with my cybersecurity problem. They don't understand where that comes from. They're missing all the context. Bring them into that discussion. I'm not saying they need to know about the nuts and bolts and, this is how you were attacked last week, but it's making them part of an understanding of what we see happening. And when people start engaging with the board at cybersecurity strategic levels, we see a lot more, let's call it loosening of the purse strings to get the money needed to spend and ultimately protect the organization. But they need to weigh this against the risk of our most important assets. So as an organization, how do we look at where we need to spend our money, what's critical data, and ultimately where should we be making the most investment to protect the organization? And we see this all the time. When we do the typical hierarchy of application stacks, they go, well, in a healthcare world, the patient data is my most important thing. Absolutely, 100% correct. But who has access to it? How do you access the particular data? That should give you an idea as to where it sits in the hierarchical scale of protection. But if I look at a very simple thing like email, if email goes down, how do you communicate with your partners? How do you communicate with your customers or your patients? And then how do you communicate with anybody else to let them know that there's a problem? You can't. That actually means that it bumps up the scale. It's really important. And we then need to weigh that up against the piece of what's the frequency of that going down. And then to the next bit is let's architect all of this from the start with security in mind. Let's not try and patch it after the fact. Oh, I've got these two things talking together, but I might need to put a firewall in or something to control that flow. No, that should be designed from the start. And that includes our form of supply chain. Let's make sure that they are part of our controls. And we've seen organizations where they have dictated and said, if you wish to be part of my supply chain, you need to adhere to the following principles and procedures and have the following technologies in place, because otherwise I can't protect myself as an organization. And the very last one, sorry, this is quite a long answer, but the very last one is, there's the concept of work on breach, or one of my alliance partners that I work with says, work on the fact that a malicious actor logs in, they don't actually break in. But work on those exercises to make sure that you're prepared for that eventuality. Because sadly, in this day and age, with the amount of attacks that are coming through and with the amount of events that we're seeing across all of our different customers, we need to make sure that we're able to handle that. And that gets down to the tabletop exercises, red team, blue team exercises, testing out to see what happens in the organization when a breach occurs. Do you know the steps? Do you have the telephone numbers of the people to phone? Do you have your counsel on hand to be able to handle, should there be a ransomware event? Do you pay or do you not pay? All of these types of things need to be mapped out and planned, because when it comes down to the crux of the organization being down, you don't want to be making silly decisions at that appropriate time. You want to be making the right decisions because it's practiced and part of your processes and procedures.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Andrew, as you know, in the US, most patient care organizations are moving at least partly into the cloud now. When it comes to clinical information systems, particularly EHRs, what has changed in terms of the threat landscape as we've been shifting into the cloud? And most organizations are in a weird mix. So they've got the feet in two boats, or whatever you want to call it. But what has changed, and what do people need to think about in terms of threats as they shift further into the cloud?
Cloud brings about a very interesting dynamic, because what do we want? We want simplicity. Cloud brings a whole bunch of amazing simplicity, innovation, the ability to scale, and all those awesome things. But the problem is, I have one universal password to access everything, because if we integrate our cloud platforms together well, I log in here, I log into my collaboration tool sets, I log into my patient record system, I log into anything else that's related. but I'm using one universal password, which means that every one of those are a form of an attack vector that someone can get into. So cloud brings about a very interesting dynamic, because now we start needing to look at particularly the most interactive tool sets, and this is where the collaboration suites come into play. They're the ones that we spend most of our day in. We have emails coming in via whatever email platform that organizations leverage. And you work in those day in and day out. You're clicking on links, you're receiving emails from the particular cloud application that's storing the health records, saying there's something's been updated, you need to click here to approve a change. Maybe if you've even moved your payment system on into the cloud, same thing, please approve this payment for this supplier. All these types of emails and links are continually coming in. But if you fall victim to a form of phishing attack, then now we've got access to one password and we can get absolutely anywhere. And that's where it's a big challenge when it comes to moving into the cloud. And users are so used to, in particular, with a lot of the collaboration suites there, they're so used to continual changes, because we've seen over the past, it's not 24 months, it's probably more like 30 months nowadays. But over the past 30 months, we've seen such a rapid move to digitization that people are seeing this continual change. Oh, we've rolled out a new product. Oh, we've updated something. Click here to update the permissions. And that is legitimate IT work. But as an end user, you can't identify when something new has been rolled out versus a slight change in permissions. And you see a pop-up box that says, hey, please accept this. And suddenly, bam, someone's got all of your access and credentials. And this is further brought to the fore by a lack of multi-factor authentication. Microsoft's own webinar back in October last year, they said anybody from an enterprise perspective, so that'll cover healthcare as well, but anybody from an enterprise perspective, only 18% of them leverage multi-factor authentication at all, which means you are a very high victim probability statistic of being caught, because there's nothing to block that style of attack, which is trying to get you to click on these links. I mean, we're all socially engineered to, in effect, answer them because an email says, action now, urgent. This system is going to be sending you something. You must make sure that it's done and sorted out right now. And we fall victim to that time and time again.
Oh yeah, and I always tell this one story, which I'll share. The classic situation is someone wants to break into the system, so they call up the purchasing department of the hospital, and they say, who's kind of your day-to-day manager of purchasing? I have a package that I sent, and I need to contact that person. Well, that's Dottie. She, and could I email her? Yes, Dottie at blah blah blah. So they send the email. Your package that went astray. And of course, as you said, it's human nature to say, oh my goodness, I have a package that went astray. I didn't even know that. So of course she clicks on it, and then 8 months later, everything's all locked up. So what do you think we need to do to be more rigorous in that regard? Obviously, multifactorial. How do we also continuously educate end users? Because as you know, our clinicians in hospitals are very overwhelmed. They have been since the start of the pandemic. Fortunately, right now, things are calming down a little bit, but they're still overwhelmed overall. And it's very hard for them. Many physicians in the US have privileges in multiple hospitals and health systems. So they've got this welter of passwords and login requirements. What's the answer?
I think it's a multi-pronged approach. Technology doesn't solve everything. We've got to have people involved in this, and we've also got to update process. I mean, if I start with just the technology, we have to have a layered approach. You can't just have one solution. Email security is a solution, and it's the one that combats against the majority of the attacks that starts via email. But we do need to have a web security solution to protect against that when we move over, because to your point, when Dottie clicks on that link and says, oh, let me go and find that package, she's moved from an email security platform to a web security platform. So we need to have some information about that and making sure that that is not an illegitimate site that is getting some malware to download or potentially ransomware. But then we also need to involve people in this, where we start to give them insight about what's taking place. How many times have you seen an email that just says, warning, it's from an external party? If I send that to you 10 times in a day, are you ultimately going to see that on the 11th time or the 12th time or the next day? You're not. You're just going to be ignoring it and going, it's just something that's there all the time. You know, it's like that broken door in your house. Sometimes we just don't tend to fix it. It's like if you jiggle it a few times and then twist the handle the wrong way and twist the key 5 times to the right, it kind of closes. We'll get used to it. So it's that type of analogy, and we need to start providing contextual information to end users to nudge them. And this is where the concept of brains come in terms of going really deep down to the core of our beings. We tend to action things as appropriate. You know, we move into the default mode of look the email, see it, respond, look email, see, respond, click on link, follow it. But if we start to add in contextual information to get the brain to be nudged slightly out, where not only do we give them information about what's taking place with color coding and say, this is what it is, be warned, we've not seen someone has sent this message to you before. No one has ever replied to this individual. And then if they click on the links, we ask them, are you really certain that you received a package? Are you 100% certain? And get them to be part of that process. But then also the last thing, this is, well, if you've never received a package, should you really click on that link? And I'll give you a small example of that. This week, I received an email that said, please click on this link and undertake the survey. And I thought, I've seen phishing attacks too many times. Well, not phishing attacks. I've seen phishing simulations too many times. I'm not going to action that. But then I read through the emails, and it was a legitimate email from my HR director saying, please follow this survey link and click on it and undertake the relevant questions. So now I've got information to say that's appropriate. I must click on it and I must action that. If I don't have that insight, don't do it. It's sadly one of the hardest things to do. I mean, Mark, I'm sure you've seen emails where if someone says to you, there's an invoice waiting for you, curiosity really did kill the cat. And it happens far too often. I can say I'm guilty of it too.
Right. Like I say, that Dottie receives the email saying your package that went astray. And she thinks, well, I didn't have a package, but I must have had one and it must have gone astray. So I must open this email, right?
Exactly. So we've got to have that layered approach of all of these different pieces and technologies and things. And ultimately, if someone says simple things like, please put your password in, please don't. Or if there's an invoice. If you're not expecting an invoice from another organization, don't do it. Don't change the payment details. This is the one that gets me all the time. They've said they've given you new payment details. Have you verified with anybody? No, I mean, how many times when you're making a payment to someone in your personal capacity, do you double check and triple check the account numbers, the routing numbers and everything else? You want to make doubly certain because you're like, that's my money. It's going to cost me if I make a mistake. Why do we not apply that logic in a business sense? Because for some reason, as individuals, we just go ahead and action it straight away. We've got to start building those processes in that says, let's verify that. Let's double check those. We've had so many instances where this occurs.
And if I may add, it's also the volume of activity of people in their work lives, right? So it's like, oh, click, and just keep going, right? Rather than stopping, because stopping to think takes time, right?
Exactly. How many of us have got into our cars, leaving, and not that we travel too much, but how many have got into our cars nowadays after a busy day and you almost go into what I call autopilot mode? You know, you turn left, you turn right, but you've not thought about anything, but you've driven perfectly the whole way home. That's sadly true, exactly to your point. That's how we operate within, particularly in email capacity, and then in our cloud applications, because we know exactly how to do it. We want to utilize the least amount of almost thinking time to achieve the quickest result.
So what are the core few things that everything you said is implicitly advice, but if you could, your elevator speech of explicit advice, what would those couple few things be?
Diversity it's not a privilege anymore. It's definitely a need. And when I talk about diversity, we're talking about it from a cybersecurity perspective. We can't have singular platforms doing everything for everybody. It goes back to that analogy. If you think of the Olympics, we all know Usain Bolt, one of the most amazing 100-meter sprinters out there, but he is a 100-meter specialist. You could argue that he did the 200 as well, but he's a 100-meter specialist. Compare his times to a decathlete. A decathlete running the 100 meters is vastly slower than Usain Bolt. Now, there's seconds involved, but seconds make all the difference. Seconds makes you second or third or fourth. But it's quite key that we look at it from a perspective of, let's make sure we've got the right technologies in place to support us. the best of breed is still proving to be the most effective solution from a cybersecurity perspective, because we need to leverage the capabilities where they are known for, the technology sets which are best to support our endpoint, best to support our web security, best to support our email security. Because without those, we land up with this hodgepodge of things, is no other way to describe it, which are there to ultimately provide you some form of protection, but don't support the organization, because we're all complex, and best of breed helps support that. And integrations needn't be complex either, because if we want to integrate those different security technologies, we need to have it simple and easy and not go to the point. You were speaking about clinicians struggling from a workload perspective. We need to also think about the cybersecurity individuals. They're also struggling because there's been so many new tool sets deployed over the past little while. And having things that are easily integrated to allow for information sharing and enhanced protection is key. You know, we wouldn't want to, just rounding that off, we don't invest in one vehicle in our personal capacities. We diversify our portfolio. We need to be thinking along similar lines when it comes to cybersecurity.
Absolutely. Very good. Thank you. What do the next couple of years look like?
I think they're going to be pretty similar, just the lure changes. If we dial ourselves back 5 or 6 years, has anything really changed? Ransomware is on the rise, absolutely. And ransomware has increased triple digits percentage-wise, 2020 to 2021. But what's the ultimate thing that's getting them in the door? Phishing attacks. What have been a problematic theme for many years? Phishing attacks. And all that changes is the lure. So when the next event comes in, we just get a new lure. And so we need to go right back and start training more effectively people in our organizations to not be a victim of a phishing attack, because I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. What I do see changing is the variants of malware out there. So as organizations, we're seeing that malware is being pulled apart and rejoined together in new strains and variants. And what's happening then is now we get into the problem of, does your platform, or rather is your platform, able to identify the strain of malware? Because it's something completely new. And zero-day style of attacks are increasing exponentially. And from there, we see more and more of the advanced style of attacks, which is, if I come in via this channel and I don't get right, I go into that one and so on. I just think we're going to see more of the same, because there's not really much difference, but it's just amping up the volume. And that is proving over from 2019 to 2020 to 2021, it's been proven to be exactly the same thing. We just dial up the volume and we start attacking people more and more and more.
Well, it's not a happy scenario, but it's good to look at it clearly in the light of the day and get to it. We need to do everything that you've advised us to do. So thank you so much for these insights, Andrew. I really appreciate them. I know our audience has learned a lot, and I have too. So thank you for being with us today.
It's only a pleasure, Mark. I had a great time chatting to you, and hopefully we can secure more organizations together.
Absolutely. So thank you all for participating in this session. This concludes the session, and have a great day.